Okay, welcome to Developmental Psychology, Psych 236. Today we're going over chapter 12, and that is middle childhood. So this is ages about 6 to 11, and we're talking about cognitive development, which has to do with learning, memory, just understanding things in general, okay? And remember that things overlap, so we will mention the brain here and there, and some of this stuff we might have even said already because a lot of stuff overlaps. Okay, so we're going to continue with Piaget, talk about Piaget's concrete operational stage. We'll talk about moral development and then language development. And it's the part about language, I think it's a little bit annoying. Okay, well, let's keep going. Some of this looks a little strange. I don't remember looking at this so much. Well, we'll see. Maybe I was thinking of another PowerPoint, I don't know. Okay, so Piaget's concrete operation stage, 7 to 11 years of age, this is middle childhood. Okay, so remember, first it was the sensory motor stage, which is mostly about reflexes and the senses. And then we have the pre-operational stage, where they're very egocentric, they don't yet have conservation, they have problems with centration and their animism and things like that. And now, when they get to age 7, they enter what Piaget called the concrete operational stage, with the concrete operation stage. And it's called concrete operation stage because this is the time when they can understand things that are concrete, okay? So things that are physical, things they can see and hear and touch. Before this, the pre-operational stage, they didn't even understand that stuff, okay? So this is the time when children can perform logical operations on their environment, but only on concrete objects. So they understand things like blocks and coins. That's how they learn math, right? That's how they learn things, that you have to make it real for them. You have to make it concrete, okay? That's what they're capable of during this stage, according to Piaget. Children understand classification, so they can understand, they can organize things into hierarchies, into categories, basically. They know that, you can teach them things like food contains like meat and grain and fruit and all kinds of other things. One's the category and the other things are the examples of things that belong in there. That's classification. And you can teach them that by actually, more importantly, by using physical things. And they know that this is a part of this and this is a part of that. That's classification. They also understand identity. The idea that, certain characteristics of an object remain the same even if others change, okay? They understand that something is still the same, even if it changes a little bit, okay? So they can understand things like conservation. The liquid has gone from this, cup, this glass to this other one, but it's still the same amount, okay? It still has the same identity. It's still the same amount of water. Okay, so that's identity, knowing that something is the same, even though it may look different. And I'm going to try not to talk too much, so we make sure we get through this. They also understand reversibility. Reversibility is the idea that something that has changed can be returned to its original state, that you can change it back. That's reversibility, right? So you can pour the liquid from one container into another, making it look like it has more, making it look taller. Remember, we looked at images like that when we talked about conservation, but then you can pour it back and it is still the same amount. You can reverse it and show it's the same amount. Or the shirt that the pre-operational child said has been ruined because it has a mustard stain on it. You can reverse that, put it in the washing machine, get it washed, gets the stain out, reverse it. It's still your favorite shirt. Look, it's fine, right? That's reversibility. Or reversibility, like when a brother says that he has a brother, he understands that that means that his brother also has a brother. He can reverse the concept. The pre-operational child, the child in the pre-operational stage, can't do this, okay? They also understand reciprocity or inversion, right? That the idea that two things can change in opposite ways in order to balance each other out. So in a conservation task, the wider, shorter container holds as much as the taller, thinner one, because the height and the width balance each other out. One is wider, but not as tall. The other one is taller, but not as wide. That's reciprocity, right? That's inversion, right? So that helps you understand conservation. So children understand all these things, right? And all these things have to do with things that are concrete, things they can see and hear and taste and touch, right? And maybe smell, right? But what they lack, and it's a very important thing, they lack abstract logical thinking. They have trouble understanding things that are basically more mental, more abstract, things they have to imagine. So they have problems with logical thinking about things that are mental concepts, things that are more like ideas, like democracy. What the heck is democracy? Try to explain that to a 7-year-old. Okay? It is an idea. It's not something that's concrete. This is the concrete operational stage. Okay? Democracy is not concrete. Or ethics. What the heck is ethics? Physics, though often refers to things that are physical, also has to do with things that are mental, equations and theories and things like that. And it's hard for children to understand physics. Now, keep in mind that some children are more advanced than others, and some children can understand these things earlier than others. While some children may be on the concrete operational stage, let's say when they're 10 years old, other children might have moved on already and might be on the next stage. But it's hard for children during this stage, if they're the average child, for them to understand things that are logical. Not logical, but things that are abstract. Logical thinking about things that are abstract. So thinking about things about mental concepts, okay? The idea that something can be right in one situation, but wrong in another confuses them. And we'll talk about right and wrong in a moment, and you'll see how that can be confusing. If I'm remembering correctly, I just have this feeling that I moved that part about morality, about right and wrong, to another chapter. I think I might have moved it, but I didn't change the overview, the outline at the beginning, because I don't recall seeing that here. I think that's in another chapter. I think I changed that. Okay, now this chapter is on cognitive development, okay? So it has to do with learning and memory. So we're gonna talk about now about those things, how children learn and about memory, okay? Information processing theory basically is an explanation of, how we process information, how we take in information. Okay, so it compares human thinking processes by analogy to computer analysis of data. According to information processing theory, our memory basically works like a computer. We take in information, we process it, and then we also spit out information just like a computer, right? It can give it to you on the screen and you can print it out, okay? So like computers, people sense and perceive large amounts of information. Computers can take in information. You type into them and they get information that way. People sense information. They see and hear things. That's how people take in information. For computers, you have to, tell them things. You have to type and, and tell them to do certain things. So the computer will seek out specific units of information, right? We seek out units of information just like a search engine does. I know I left out the parenthesis there. The computer analyzes information. We analyze information just like computers do, just like software programs do. And we express the conclusions to another person, just like a computer can, print out, a report or show you a report on the screen. So all that says is that our brains work like computers, okay? We take in information, we process it, and then we give out information. And it basically, this theory says that, this theory really is about memory. It says we have 3 kinds of memory. Now, I went over this in detail in Psych 101, and I'm assuming you've heard something about it before, so I'm gonna go through it more briefly here. Remember, we do cover a bunch of chapters in this class, so I assume that you know some things already. So according to this theory, we really have 3 kinds of memory. We have sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Sensory memory, also called the sensory register, is when we store incoming information for about a split second so that we can process it. Sensory memory is basically, to tell you more about it, that is just when our senses pick up information. It's when we see something, we hear something, we smell something, we taste something. Our senses pick up information and it only stays in memory for maybe half a second, not much longer, okay? maybe half a second, maybe a few seconds, okay? It's sensory memory. It's just your senses picking up information. It doesn't really last. So think about this. When you see something and then you immediately look away, what happens is that you immediately forget a lot of about what you saw. Like when you're driving, you're paying attention to the road, but there's a lot of stuff happening around you, a lot of other cars passing by, and it may even be people. But if somebody asks you later on, hey, what kind of cars were those? What color were there? You know, were they trucks? Were they vans? Were they, you know, just passing, you know, a regular sedan? You know, what did they look like? What were the people in those cars? What did they look like? You might say, I don't really remember. You don't, because you just looked at it and you immediately looked away and it didn't stick. Your senses don't really store information. They just collect information. That is sensory memory. If you pay attention to the information and you do something with it, it gets into what we call working memory. Working memory is short-term memory. It's memory for things that last maybe a few minutes. So working memory is also called short-term memory. It is basically the information that you are currently focused on. So it involves current conscious mental activity. When you are speaking, you're thinking about that information. When you are writing, when you're solving a math problem, all that is using working memory. It's also when you're tying your shoes, right? When you are exercising, whenever you are doing something, whether it's mental or physical, you're using working memory. You are working with information. That information doesn't last very long either, only lasts a few minutes while you are actually using it, okay? Working memory improves steadily in middle childhood. Sensory memory, by the way, we said that children are born with all their senses. Sensory memory works, okay? But it doesn't store information very long. Working memory gets better through middle childhood, and we'll talk about how in a bit later, okay? So that's working memory. It involves you using information. If you use the information long enough, it could get into what we call long-term memory, okay? Which lasts a long time. So long-term memory stores virtually limitless amounts of information. Long-term memory doesn't get full, okay? How many things can you remember for a long period of time? For, you know, weeks, months, years. It's virtually limitless. The more you learn, the more stuff is in there. And that also steadily increases with experience and education. It increases as we get older and we learn more things. But there's three kinds of memory. And you should have heard about these from Psych 101. Sensory memory, which is just your senses, picking up information. Working memory, which is when you use information. And long-term memory, which is when information is stored relatively permanently. So here's information about advances in memory. So we related to development. When you're under 2 years of age, memory is more implicit. We said this before, actually. Where memory has more to do with, you know, sights and sounds, right? With like your senses, right? It has more to do with. So implicit memory is basically memory for habits and emotions, to put it bluntly, okay? So implicit memory are things that you remember because they are emotional in some way, or habits, things you do and again. So sights and sounds, for instance, an interactive toy, a caregiver's voice, can trigger these kinds of memories, right? The sight might trigger, right, the memory, right? You see the cat and that triggers the memory of the cat scratching you, right? And makes you fearful. That's implicit memory. Or you see a toy and that triggers your memory of how to play with it and you play with it, right? That's a habit, an action, a routine, right? It triggers that memory. So under age 2, memory is implicit. It's not explicit. We can't really say what we remember, but we do remember things. We remember things that are emotional, and we remember things that have to do with routines, things we do over and over again. But there's different kinds of memory, okay? There's also explicit memory. That starts about age 2. 2 to 5 years of age is when explicit memory begins. In other words, this is when you start using words to encode or to learn or even retrieve memories. Although children do not yet use memory strategies during this time, they remember things that have to do with words. They remember things by rote. So they remember a phone number because of the order. Let's say they can remember a phone number if they see it often enough because of the order of the words. Or nursery rhymes, when they hear words in a certain order, and they rhyme, right? So they can tell you, you know, that they remember, yeah, they remember that song, and they may even be able to sing it, right? Or they remember that phone number, or they recognize it, for instance. They can tell you they remember something, in other words. That's explicit memory. Explicit memory is memory, to put it bluntly, it's memory for words, right? For information and episodes and things that you do. Like you remember that song, remember singing that song. That's explicit memory. By 5 to 7 years of age, they realize that they need to remember something, so they start using strategies like repeating something over and over again to help them remember it. This is not a good strategy for remembering something. It takes too long to learn things in that way. But repetition can lead to automation. Repeating something over and over again can lead to it being automatic, where you easily remember it. Or you can easily do something because you've done it over and over again, like writing and reading. You do it over and over again, that's repetition, right? If you do it often enough, it will become easier, it will become automatic. So that's kind of how memory works, but there's more. 7 to 9 years of age, right? Children learn strategies, learn new strategies about how to remember things. They can start using visual clues to remember how something looks, right? Or what it is. You know, like, for instance, like they might learn that, you know, the C has the k sound by basically visualizing a cat and drawing that C around the cat's head or something, okay? That's a visual clue that helps you remember something. So children start learning strategies like this, visualizing things, okay? And by the way, teachers help them do this. They have images, they have things to link, let's say, the words and the letters, you know, to certain things to help them remember. They start learning, you know, words and stuff. And, you know, and sounding it out and stuff like that. And they use visual clues, okay? Visual things that help them remember those sounds, help them remember what those words mean. Auditory hints as well, rhymes, right? Letters, you know. All these things help them remember things. So we know that rhymes can help you remember things. You know, like that, you know, the alphabet song. You know, for instance, you know, there's some rhymes in there, or the rainbow song, you know, they can learn, you know, the colors of the rainbow by, you know, the rainbow song. I'm not going to sing it for you, but there's rhymes in there. Okay. They start learning rhymes and letters. All this helps them learn things. So they start using strategies. There's evidence of this in brain functions called the visual spatial sketchpad. So the visual spatial sketchpad is basically a part of the brain, a function that helps you remember things that are visual. And then the phonological loop helps you remember things that have to do with sounds. So memory for things you hear. So memory for things you see is stored in the visual spatial sketchpad, and memory for things that you hear are stored in the phonological loop. All right, those are brain functions. So yes, this has to do with the brain. Children benefit from organizing things, right, into categories. Okay, all this helps them remember. 9 to 11 years of age, memory becomes more adaptive. Children start using strategies, and they learn various memories techniques from teachers and from other children. They organize material themselves, develop their own strategies to help them learn things. And that's how memory kind of varies according to research, how children's memories improve and they become more basically better at able to learn things and to remember things, and better able to use strategies. Let's talk more about information processing. So we're going to talk now about the knowledge base, the things that children learn and become part of the knowledge base, okay? The knowledge base makes it easier for them to master new related information. So the more things you know, the easier it is for you to learn new things. And the knowledge base, the things you have in memory, the things that you have as part of your base, right, in memory, are influenced, of course, by your experience. The more experiences you have, the more things you learn, right? Opportunities to learn those things, right? You need to provide children for opportunities. Like I said, they need to go to school, they need to play, they need to do different things, right? You know, the more they play with computers or tablets, they're learning things, okay? But also personal motivation. Children need to be motivated to learn things. The more motivated they are to learn something, the more their knowledge base can grow. So new concepts are best learned if it's connected to something personal or something emotional, something the child cares about. You need to make it meaningful for them. And that's why teachers and parents will help children learn the letters of the alphabet by using things like animals. Children love animals. You know, they like animals for some reason. And they like, you know, to play outside, and they like things like that, okay? Things to do with nature and animals. Cute little fuzzy things, you know, toys. So you can learn them, you can help them learn by connecting what they have to learn with those things, the alphabet, the words, all that stuff. You want to teach them, you know, the alphabet, you can use animals, you use things like that. Teach them certain words. Try using the words of animals, words that refer to animals. They're naturally interested in animals for some reason. More about information processes, right? We also have, control processes. Control processes are neurological mechanisms that regulate the flow of information. So control processes are processes, mechanisms in the brain, basically, that help us organize information, you know, organize it so it's easier to learn, right? Prioritize it, right? Some information's, you know, more important than others, so we're more likely to prioritize it and store that differently, organize that differently. And it also directs mental operations. The flow of information, for instance, right? When we use it. The control processes are also often called executive processes. Remember, the executive is basically, when it comes to corporation, the executive is the one that makes the decisions, that decides what's going to happen. So the control process in the brain are like the executive process. It directs the flow of information, how it's stored, how it's organized, how you're going to use it. The ability to use this information is called executive function. It's basically your mind controlling the flow and the storage of information and how you use that information. It improves with age and experience, of course, just like everything else. But it includes processing speed, right? How quickly you can process things, right? We'll talk about that. Metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. I'll explain that. And meta memory, which is thinking about memory. I'll explain about that. So this sounds a bit weird, but it'll become more understandable as we talk about it. And I think we talked about this before. This looks very familiar for some reason. And I showed you that image more than once, and I'd show you an image of a neuron more than once. Speed of processing. I don't know why this looks very familiar. So, or maybe I just looked at it recently. I don't know. But speed of processing continues to improve through childhood and adolescence, right? Adolescence will come later. It's after this period of development, right? It continues to improve. Okay, children become better at remembering things, better at using information, better at recalling information, faster at thinking and making decisions. That's speed up processing. Why? Because of the ongoing myelination. Remember, myelin is that fatty tissue around the axon of the neuron that speeds the transmission of information. The development of the prefrontal cortex, right? It helps you focus, control your emotions, to plan all those things. As that develops, it also helps with the speed of processing. The brain is better able to basically recall information and basically control the flow of information. And the front part of the brain is the one that controls basically, you know, emotions, planning, what you focus on, all that stuff. So all that affects speed of processing as well. Dendrites become more dense. Basically, you know, those are the spiky things around the soma, the round part of the neuron that allows for connections. So that allows more connections, and that improves speed of processing, okay? Repetition also makes neurons fire more instantaneously and in coordinated ways. The more you repeat something, the more you do something, it's like the stronger the pathways become in the brain, okay? That speeds thinking and frees up capacity. As you repeat things, they're more likely to become automatic, and as they become automatic, then it's like you have more room in your brain to think about other things, okay? So think of it this way. When you are first giving a speech in front of the class, you are so worried about what the class is going to think that you fumble over your words. You're trying very hard just to remember what to say. As you get better at making speeches, they will become more or less automatic. And you will not only be able to give your speech, you'll have memory available and just space available in your, in your brain and your mind to be able to notice what participants are doing. I mean, what the listeners are doing, right? And actually engage them in the conversation and think of other examples, it frees up your mind, so to speak. When you repeat something over and over again, it becomes easy, it becomes automatic, and that allows you to think about other things at the same time. So it allows more information to be processed and remembered. It advances thinking. Automation, which I just told you about, requires repetition, requires practice. You have to do things over and over again. It can take years. Children get better at reading and writing, and the more they do it, the better they get. The more you do math, the better you get at it, okay? And after a while, it becomes automatic. Think about how easy it is now for you to read, right? And for you to sound out the words. And you might find writing a little bit more difficult, but even that becomes automatic as well. For some of you, it's already automatic. You know how to do it very well. And by the way, you lose cognitive skills over the summer due to lack of practice. So children have, our education system is built around the farming schedule, believe it or not. We go to school in the fall, and then we take time off in the winter, okay? To kind of, I guess, start preparing for the crops that are going to be available in the spring, okay? And then we go to school again, and then we have this long summer off. Why do you think we have a long summer off? Because in the past, that's when kids went back to the farm and they help basically gather the produce, and there's a lot of work to do around the farm. Our schedule is built around that. Well, this long summer, kids often don't do very much to improve their skills. They don't read very much or do any math. And so they can lose skills over the summer, and then they go back to school, and then they have to kind of reinforce these skills. The teacher might have to backtrack a little bit and work on some remedial stuff before she can move forward, or he. Knowledge base grows, of course, what children know increases, right? And all this increases learning and memory. But I feel like I said that already, or at least I mentioned automation before. More about information processing, executive function, more about executive function, remember, has to do with that part of your brain that controls things, the flow of information, how you use information, right? How, focusing, making a plan, and other things that I mentioned before, right? But I want to speak about it with respect to executive function. So executive function, includes these things here. Executive function includes something called metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. So you think about your own thinking. So for instance, you evaluate a cognitive task, or just a task, something you have to do to determine how best to accomplish it. So maybe you have to learn a list of spelling words, and you are gonna think about how it's best to learn that, how it's best to remember that. You are thinking about thinking. You're making a plan. That's what that is. You monitor and adjust your performance on the task. If something's not working very well, you might think about another strategy. Think about another way to tackle it, right? So you are thinking about thinking. You're thinking about strategies. You're planning. That's metacognition. It improves with age and experience, of course, as does everything else. And meta memory is knowing about memory. It's when you think about memory. You are still thinking about thinking, but it's specifically about memory. So you think about how best to learn a song or remember those spelling words. The example with metacognition was an example of meta memory as well. But thinking about thinking, like metacognition could also be that you're thinking about, let's say, how to solve a puzzle. And you think about, well, if I do this, if I do that, right? You're thinking about thinking. It's a strategy. Meta memory specifically about memory. And that's the example about, like, you have a list of spelling words you need to remember. So you think about how you can best learn that, how you can best remember that. Maybe you turn them into a song. Maybe you use rhymes. Maybe you visualize things, right? That's meta memory. It's you thinking about your own memory. Either way, you're thinking about your own thinking. Let's talk about language development. And I feel like maybe I'm going too slow. There's a lot of information here. Language development. So middle childhood is a time when children acquire what we call the pragmatics of language. Children at this point are good enough at language, and they start thinking about practical applications of language. In other words, they start being more practical in how they use language. Language is not always used the same way. So the pragmatics of language, pragmatic just means practical. The pragmatics of language refers to the practical application of language that involves tone of voice, word choice, grammar rules, definitions, context. So the pragmatics of language, that's what it is. So for instance, children get better at, using certain words, right? Word choice, right? Like they get better at using metaphors, like walking on eggshells. they know that literally it doesn't mean eggshells, but it means you have to be careful, right? Egg on my face, it means they're embarrassed. It doesn't literally mean you have egg on your face, right? Or last one is a rotten egg. You don't really mean that they're a rotten egg, right? But they get better at using metaphors, right? Using language in a certain way, in a practical way to mean something else, right? That's pragmatic. That's a practical use of language. They get better at word choice, right? They know it's okay to use certain words with some people, but not with others. It's okay to call your friend a rotten egg, or it's okay to call your friend a dude or something like that, but not your parents. Your parents are like, what did you call me? Right? Or your teacher, hey, like, hey, homie, you know, you can't call your teacher that. Your teacher's like, what did you call me? I'm not your homie, right? That's word choice, right? You use different words for different people. And, you know, we'll talk about also, I'm not sure if it comes up today, but also, you know, like your, what's the word? But the way you talk to people, the code you use, right? It also affects your word choice, but code is something I think we'll talk about later. Tone of voice is also something practical, right? You can say you like something with a sad voice, right? That means you don't like it. Your tone of voice reveals something, and children understand tone of voice, and they use it to basically to convey different feelings, right? A child can say, yeah, this was just what I wanted, right? When they get a sweater, when instead maybe they wanted a toy, right? But the tone of voice, right? They use tone of voice to tell you, no, this isn't really what I wanted. Okay, so they learn the pragmatics of language. They use language in a practical way, and that's what that refers to. Speaking to language, I think we're going to talk about codes soon, code switching. So speaking to language, there are plenty of children who speak two languages or even more, right? And how do you teach those languages? What's the best way? Okay, so there's different teaching approaches, okay? Language learning in general depends on the child, right? It depends a lot on the child, right? Their motivation, their eagerness to learn, their ability to learn. For some children, it's easier. Some children are more motivated. All that matters. But also the home environment literacy. That doesn't sound right, but the literacy in the home environment. Is it an environment with books? Is it an environment where there's a lot of language used, right? A lot of complex language, right? Yes, the language that is used in the home environment matters as well. Literacy, right? Are they exposed to a lot of language? Nowadays, people don't necessarily need to have physical books. We can store books on tablets and Kindles and things like that. And we can store a lot more books in a device than we can in a library. In the past, only the rich people could have libraries. They had these huge rooms, right? Where they had hundreds or thousands of books. Now you can have hundreds or thousands of books in a tablet and tell that rich person, look here, I have as many books as you. I don't have to be rich, right? Look at me, right? I'm well read. I have all these books. I've read all these bunch of books, right? Well, it's good that you expose your children to a lot of language, a lot of books, or a lot of information in general, okay? That the home environment matters, not just what you have, but also how you speak. But also the teacher's warmth, right? How nice is the teacher? How encouraging is the teacher? The training of the teacher, how good is she or he at teaching language, at teaching those skills? And in general, I think I mentioned this before because there's a lot of, sometimes we backtrack and sometimes things come up earlier than I meant to say it, right? Or earlier, before we get to that chapter, because I always get ahead of myself. Language learning changes with age, the language learning ability, okay? During infancy and early childhood, it's almost effortless, the ability to learn language. Children learn language very easily when they're young. In middle childhood, it's harder to learn language. If they are behind, if they have trouble because they were neglected or whatever it is, they weren't exposed to language, it will take more work for them to learn language and catch up. And there are people who are English language learners, ELLs, children in the US with very low English proficiency. That means they don't speak English very well, don't know English very well. Their first language is not English. What's the best way to teach those children? And by the way, if those children are infants, if they're in infancy, early childhood, they will learn English very quickly, rapidly, almost effortlessly. I came to this country as an immigrant. My mother brought me here when I was 6 years of age, and I was very young. I picked up the language in like a year. I was less than that. I was fluent, okay? Because it's easy to learn language when you're young. If you're older, and you're a more recent immigrant and you're older, it's going to be harder for you to learn language. But these children that are not so good at English, what's the best way to teach them English? There's some debate about that. One approach is, so learning a second language, one approach is total immersion, where instruction occurs only in the second language. So only instruction in English, for instance, if you wanted to learn English. It's that sink or swim kind of approach. The teacher's not going to speak Spanish, probably can't even speak Spanish, and they're just going to teach you in English. And you have to adapt. You have to get it, okay? It's not a very successful approach after puberty. After puberty, when you use total immersion and kids don't know how to say things, they feel shy, they feel stupid, socially isolated. It's not as helpful after puberty because children care too much about what others think and they feel stupid, they feel shy, they may not try, they may give up. But total immersion is this. Put it to you this way. Hey, you want to learn English? Guess what? Read only in English, okay? Watch TV in English. Listen to English music, English poetry. Go watch English plays, right? You buy packages and there's English on them, okay? Total immersion. In other words, you immerse yourself in the world of the English language. You want to learn French? You want to learn French? Go to France. Order from their menus. Watch their TV. Listen to their music. That is immersion. It's basically, it's like being submerged. It's like you're going underwater. You're going into that world where only that language exists. That's total immersion. So they basically say, forget about your Spanish, right? We're going to give you everything in English and you just have to get it. And if you watch TV, you listen to music, you read and do all this stuff in that same language, even talk to friends who speak that way, make friends that only speak English, right? You'll get it after a while. You'll learn it. You're a part of that world and you are going to learn it. It's easier when you're younger, of course. Reverse immersion is the opposite, where first they teach you in your native language. So maybe first they just teach you Spanish for several years until you get good at Spanish. And then they teach you English. When you've learned something about Spanish, they teach you the second language as a foreign language. And it'll be easier for you to learn the second language because you already know a lot about your language, let's say, and it'll be easier. It's not as very successful when it's used to teach English-speaking Americans a second language. It doesn't seem to work so well for Americans, like they've already learned English, right? And now they have to learn a second language as a foreign language. In general, Americans are not too interested in learning a second language, I'll tell you that, okay? In this country, a lot of people have the attitude that, hey, in this country, we speak English, the heck with your Spanish, your Chinese, you learn English, right? A lot of people believe that here, and they're not as receptive to just learning a foreign language in general. Keep in mind, it is different in other countries, especially in Europe. They consider you to be illiterate if you don't know at least like 3 languages, because there's a lot of countries right next to each other. They speak a lot of languages. And you have to be able to communicate with these people. And they have a European Union now. They all move freely within those countries, right? They want to be like the US, and the individual countries are like states now. That's the European Union. Although, as you can see, Britain is having Brexit, right? They want to break away for several reasons, and other countries may do so as well. But they're trying to compete with the US by making all those little countries like states, and then having one big country that they call the European Union, like the United States, right? But for them, it's the European Union. But they have a very different approach over there to language. They believe that the more languages you know, the better. That's a very different belief than this country, where they believe that English is what matters, and that's what you need to know, and screw you and all your other languages, right? A lot of people have that attitude, but it's not necessarily the correct attitude. You can learn a different language also by having what's called bilingual education. Bilingual education is when subjects are taught in the native language and the second language. They use both languages simultaneously, okay? Or it could also be English as a second language, ESL. That's what was used when I was in college. When I was in high school, and there were people who didn't speak English and were recent immigrants, and they were put into these ESL classes. It's intensive study of basic English in a separate class. They don't get to go to normal English class. They go to this ESL class until they get really good at it, until they can be educated in an English-only class. Once you learn English well enough from this ESL class, then you can take the regular English class. Because if they just put them in a regular English class, they're probably going to fail. If they were to just put them in the regular English class, by the way, and forget about the ESL, forget about that other language, that would be like immersion, okay? But not total immersion. They also need to immerse themselves in the culture. But that was ESL. And I remember a lot of people that were in that. I had some friends who were like that, even a girlfriend, you know, like that. But that's ESL. I never had it. Like I said, I came to this country very young, and I picked up the language very quickly. In like less than a year, I was fluent. All my education has actually been in English, all of it. I had no education whatsoever in Spanish. Actually, I did take Spanish for a year in high school, and it was a very easy class. It's ridiculous how easy it is when it's your native language, of course. Let's talk more about language development. What about reading skills? What's the best way to teach reading? Okay, never mind the whole ESL thing. Now let's just talk about reading in general, okay? What's the best way to teach people how to read? There is the phonics approach, where children basically learn the sounds of each letter and putting those sounds together to make simple words, to make words, right? The phonics approach works very well with certain languages like Spanish, Italian, right? Languages where the sound letter combinations are clear, okay? Now in English, it does work in English, but remember that in English, you also have words and letters that sound very different than the way you think. You know, like the word colonel or other words, because they come from other languages. And all of a sudden, the rules about how it sounds and how you put it together is different now. And that's confusing to people. English is a very hard language. Not as hard as other languages. But the phonics approach does work relatively well. It's just that there are some words that you have to sound out differently, where the usual rules don't apply. But that's phonics. You learn it by sounding it out. And this is usually what is used. That's usually what I see. That's the way I taught my kids, right? And my wife, you know, we give our children instruction as well, not just in school. And that's what I see that they do at school. There's also the whole language approach that encourages development of all language skills, talking and listening, reading and writing to aid communication. Children here are encouraged to write, right? Even if they don't know how, just write and invent their own spelling. You don't know how to spell that? Just write it the way you think it sounds to you, right? You don't know how to read that? Read that according to how you think it sounds. That's called the whole language approach. It doesn't stress this little step-by-step kind of approach. It's more like just speak, just read, just write, and you'll get better at it over time. And I've seen that. You know, I remember my cousin when I was a kid would write a note for his mom, say, oh, we went to the mall. And he spelled mall, M-O-L, mall, okay? But of course, now he can write that well, but that's part of it. Just write however you can, read however you can, and you'll get better at it. That's the whole language approach. It's kind of like immersion, right? Just do it, and you'll get better at it. But the phonics approach is very steady, very organized. It's like, learn this sounds, put these sounds together, these makes these words, and, that's phonics. By the way, vocabulary size is the best predictor of school achievement and overall intelligence. The more vocabulary your child has, the more likely they are going to do well in school and then go on to succeed. And by the way, it's of course the vocabulary of the language that is used in that country. So in this country, it is English, right? The more English words they know, the bigger their vocabulary, the better they're going to do at school and in college. Some children have large vocabularies, some children do not. Low SES children are exposed to less language. Children who are poor are exposed to different language and less language. Think about how your parents speak when you're poor. Your parents are not educated. They didn't go to college. They're not professionals. So how do they speak to you? Right? That's the language you learn. You're going to have a smaller vocabulary. The way they talk to you, hey, son, go get me that thing over there. Now hurry up. What do you mean, what thing? That thing. What thing? That stupid thing. You know what I mean, right? And in Spanish, agarrame eso, güey, cabrón, or like whatever it is, or el volado, eso, right? They don't have that much language themselves, so they can't really speak, with an expansive vocabulary. They don't use those college level words. But guess what? If your parents are educated, they went to college, they're professional, they're lawyers, they're doctors, they speak differently to their children. Their children learn language much faster and much more advanced language. I had a big disadvantage, by the way. My mother only had like a third grade education. My dad was not around. You know, guess what I heard, right? But now my children are different. Both me and my wife are professionals. I'm a professor. She's an English teacher. Our kids are much better off because of that. Although my son has autism, so he still has problems. But my daughter doing very well as far as language, way ahead of the average. Okay, and yes, she has an advantage because now she's being brought up in a very different environment than I grew up in, or that my wife grew up in. Other social factors social factors in the language gap. Yes, some children are better at language than others. They have bigger vocabularies. They're more ahead. Some children are very bad at language, very behind as far as the English skills. So socioeconomic status matters, right? Low SES children, like I said, they hear less language. They have smaller vocabularies, right? Simpler vocabularies, shorter sentences because of what they hear and the way people speak to them. That's what they hear. It's hard to have an advanced vocabulary and sound like a professional when you grow up around just, you know, average working class people or people who are poor who hardly know any language themselves. Correlations, yes, language also has something to do with the development of the hippocampus. The hippocampus allows the different halves of the brain to communicate. Improper parental care also matters, or prenatal care matters as well, right? If the mother didn't take care of herself very well, you know, use drugs, or other things that could harm the developing infant, right? The developing embryo and fetus, right? Children not having breakfast, they're not ready to learn. They're hungry, they're distracted, not ready to learn at school. Their brains aren't energized. Lead, we talked about lead poisoning in the water from pipes, from old pipes in old homes. Crowded housing is stressful. Neighborhood violence, all of that is very, very bad for language development. And all of that is very common in children who are poor, you know, or grew up in very poor households. Beyond correlations, the language that is used at home, I talked about that already. The mother's education matters a lot. Mothers are the most important because they're the ones who talk more to their children. They're more involved than the father. So the mother's education actually matters more than the father's education. Having books, you don't have to have physical books anymore, but just being exposed to a lot of language. And by the way, tablets count too, you know. Hey, rather than watching news on TV, why don't you read the articles? That's what I do. I read about the news because the news you see on TV is just entertainment. Actually, even the articles is just entertainment too. But it's better to read it than to see it. Okay? It's very dumbed down when they just show it to you. Okay? Expectations, adult positive expectations. Do you believe your children can learn and that they're going to achieve? If you believe that you have good expectations, your children are better off for that. Share teacher expectations. Your teacher, right? Also, do the parents and the teachers have the same expectations? Maybe the teacher believes the child can succeed, but not the parent. There are plenty of parents that believe that their children are not going to amount to much, that they're going to be basically screw-ups like they are, or that because they're poor, their children aren't going to achieve much, right? Sometimes it's the opposite, where the parents believe their children will achieve, but the teacher thinks that the kid is a dumbass or something like that, right? There are plenty of teachers that don't really believe in those kids. And a lot of it, by the way, has to do with race. There is racism and stereotypes about, you know, about language and who's better at it and stuff like that, and all kinds of things, okay? And intelligence. Teachers' attitudes matter a lot. Your children are more susceptible to being affected negatively by those teacher attitudes when they're young. When they're older, not as much. Children already know a lot about who they are, and they're advanced enough that they can basically tell the teacher, screw you, I'm going to succeed and I'm going to do well despite what you think. But when they're children, when they're younger, the teacher affects them greatly, right? Their motivation, their ability to learn. And if the teacher doesn't teach them very well, then they're not going to do very well. So if your kid isn't doing well and you think it's the teacher, pull them out of that classroom, take them somewhere else. I'm going to go through this quickly, but all this annoying stuff, there's a lot of information here, too much information. And I just put it in a table for you guys to make it easy. We're going to go through it quickly. But here's what your children should be capable of doing at different ages. By 4 to 5 years of age, children should understand basic concepts. Okay? Like, for instance, the books are written from front to back, right? And we read, and things are written from left to right. And by the way, in other countries, some other languages, it's from right to left in some places. But they should understand things like that, right? They should recognize their letters, recognize and spell their own names. Okay, by 6 to 7, They should know the sounds of the consonants and the vowels, including 2 sounds, right? Use sounds to figure out words and should be able to read simple words like cat. By 8 years of age, they should read simple sentences, okay? About 50 words per minute. They should be able to read words with 2 syllables or more, right? Understand basic punctuation, like where to use a period, okay? Start with a capital, right? Consonant vowel blend, they should understand blends. Blends, you know, the word blend is a blend. The B and the L sound. You have to blend those to say the word correctly, okay? They should comprehend what they read. They should be able to understand what they read. At the beginning, when they're just learning how to read, they read and they work so hard just trying to read, they don't even understand what the heck they read. By this time, they should be able to read and actually be able to tell you something about what they read. 9 to 10 years of age, they read and they understand paragraphs and chapters, okay? They can answer questions about what they read, comprehension questions, okay, about concepts, so they can get, you know, quizzes and tests about like what they read, reading comprehension tests, remember those, right? About concepts, about facts. They can read polysyllabic words like vegetarian, population, right? 9 to 10 years of age, right? 11 to 12, their reading should be very rapid and very fluent, more than 100 words a minute. Vocabulary, right? They should know vocabulary with specialized meaning, like what does the word environment means. They should understand paragraphs. They can sound out new words, words they haven't seen before. They can sound them out and they can basically read them correctly. Figure out what words mean by using the content, the context, I should say, and even read for pleasure. By 13 years of age and onward, they continue to build vocabulary right. They're always building vocabulary right. Comprehend things a lot better. More emphasis on comprehension, less on how they talk, how they read, but more on what they understand. They can understand textbooks, right? That's if your kid is average. I will tell you that my daughter is way ahead of this. She's gonna be 10 soon, right? But my son is way behind because he's on the autism spectrum. My daughter is years ahead, my son is years behind. And that's kind of sad, okay? About this time, numbers, what about numbers? What about math? 4 to 5 years of age, your child should be able to count to 20. Understand the meaning of more or less. Which one is more, which one is less, right? Understand one-to-one correspondence of objects. Here's 2 objects, right? This is the number 2. This is what 2 means, right? Understand numbers, okay? Recognize and name shapes. This is a circle, this is a triangle. By 6 years of age, you should be able to count to 100. My son's gonna be 8, he can't count to 100, he can probably count to 20, okay? They should be able to understand what bigger and smaller means, right? Which one is bigger, which one is smaller, right? Add and subtract 1-digit numbers. 8 years of age, add and subtract 2-digit numbers, simple multiplication and division, simple word problems with 2 variables. They should be able to do that. By 10 years of age, they should be able to add, subtract, multiply, divide multiple digit numbers, not single digit, double, even triple digits, quadruple digits, right? They should understand simple fractions, percentages, area, the perimeter of shapes. Perimeter is, basically the distance around, right? Understand word problems with 3 variables. Those word problems, by the way, are hard, if you remember those, right? 12 years of age, they should begin to use abstract concepts, right? What is an X? What is a Y? It could really be anything. An X could be any number, so can a Y, right? Begin to understand formulas and even simple algebra. But you know what? In this country, we're not very good at math, okay? We're behind. And we'll talk about that. Speaking of that, here's the information about that. And I know I slowed down and now I'm still going slow. I think I'm not going too slow, but I think I'm just talking too much. But I think I'm going at a good pace. We'll finish this, but we probably won't have a ton of time for discussion. Okay, learning is okay. International testing. Okay, so how does the US compare in general when it comes to reading and writing, when it comes to math and science? I'm sure you've heard some bad things about this country with regard to that other countries are doing better than us. Okay, when you might have heard that we're bad. We're not bad, okay? But we should be doing better. So there's international testing. Over the past 2 decades, more than 50 countries, more than 50 nations have participated in at least one massive international test of educational achievement. So many countries participate and they take these international tests, right? One of them is the International Achievement Test Scores. One of them is Progress in International Reading Literacy Study, the PEARLS, which basically tests reading skills, reading comprehension, and Trends in Math and Science, that's the TIMS. That's the one that tests math ability and science, by the way. That's the TIMS. Okay, and here's a chart that shows you how countries are doing. And not all the countries, the US is in purple. Okay. At the bottom, well, let me tell you about the ones at the top first. So at the top, you have there's Singapore, right? Singapore doing very well in math, well in reading, and very well in science. Singapore, right? That's an Asian country. I'll put this in general, right? Asian people are kicking our butts in general. China, Japan, all those countries, they are very strict about education. And they are beating us, okay, as Americans. Finland is orange. They're doing very well. Finland used to be bad, but they changed some things and now they're doing well, okay? The average is in gray there. The US is in purple. We're worse than average in math, and we're about average in reading and science, and average is not good. This is the richest country in the world. That we should be the best. We have more than those other countries. We should pay our teachers more. We should have better education. But there's a lot of discrimination, a lot of racism, a lot of fighting over money in this country, a lot of politics, okay? And we should be doing better. But you should see the emphasis they put on education in some of those other countries. You should see how they pay teachers and what they think of teachers. They think of teachers as professionals, right? Highly esteemed, highly honored. In this country, teachers, I mean, a lot of people don't even like them. We attack teachers all the time. You know, we need to pay teachers better. We need to provide better training so they can do a better job. If teaching was a more respected profession in this country, we would attract better people, better teachers, smarter teachers, better teachers, and then our students would be better off for it. But we don't. Teachers are middle class. They're paid okay. They're not that highly respected, believe it or not. Professors are, like me, but not teachers, not K through 12. We look down on them. A lot of parents, you know, like criticize them, and a lot of people want to take away their rights to a good wage and you know, defund schools. And I said, what the hell is that, right? Our kids are going to suffer because of that, right? It's different in other countries, right? I'm not saying all teachers are good. Some of them are bad, yeah. But what I'm saying is that if we treated the profession differently, like it's a real profession of professionals like doctors and lawyers, we could pay teachers more and we would attract top talent. We would attract the better teachers. And you know what happens with teaching? The teachers are the ones who couldn't get a job as lawyers. They couldn't get a job as real scientists, so they teach science instead. They couldn't get a job as musicians, so they teach music. They're your average people. They're not necessarily the best. That's the reality in this country about teachers. They're average. They're mediocre, right? Because we don't treat the profession the way it should be treated to attract the best people. But in science and math, that's different. There you need to be different, okay? Not for teaching, but at least in the professions. Okay, look, down there, I know we have the Dominican Republic in green. Come on, that's a very poor country, okay? They're doing a lot worse, but that's understandable. It's a very poor country. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, okay? So let's keep going. So now you see that, yeah, now you know why people criticize us, right? The pearls in general, girls are ahead of boys, right? Girls seem to be better at language than boys. In every country, we see this pattern. So there might be some biological difference there, and something to do with the hippocampus and other things. But boys seem to be better in math and science overall in every country. So there are some differences. They may be biological, or they may reflect actually favoritism and treating people different in school or as parents, right? That we encourage girls for some things, but not others. We encourage boys for other things and not others. The TIMS reveals that there are gender differences in math, right? But they have narrowed, right? Girls are catching up to boys. And there's this gender similarities hypothesis that says that, you know, maybe there is no, that maybe boys aren't really that much better at math. They're not really better at math. It just reflects these advantages that boys may have to girls when it comes to things related to math. Things about the classroom, girls tend to get higher grades overall. Girls tend to be better students, but there is a dip at puberty. When puberty hits, everything changes, and all of a sudden you'll have girls who used to do well that might all of a sudden not care as much. Same thing with boys. As a matter of fact, one of the hardest grades to teach, not grades, but it's hard to teach middle school. Those are those kids that just started puberty, but they're still very young. It's very hard to teach those kids. Motivation drops during that time. We'll talk about that later, but that happens, okay? But girls tend to be better than boys as far as being students overall. And I don't know if I told you guys, but girls nowadays, or females, are getting the vast majority of advanced degrees, college degrees, AAs, and advanced degrees. They're leaving males behind. And in the future, you'll find the reverse. You'll find that girls are doing a lot better than boys in general. Okay, that's what's happening. Schooling in the United States. So there's arguments over how do we improve our schools, the academic performance of these kids, right? There has been improvement over decades. We have gotten better, by the way, but we're still behind. We should be better, right? We should be among the top. We should be close to, if not tied, for first place. As rich as this country is, as privileged as this country is, right? There are still gaps between those of different income. The rich still do better than the middle and the lower class, or the middle and upper class still does better than the lower classes. And there are still gaps in ethnic groups with minorities, right? Minorities like, Black people and Latinos scoring lower. Asian people, by the way, do not. Asian people do as well as whites and even better. I'll tell you in general about Asian people. Asian people do better than whites on math. And here's the surprising thing. They're even outscoring white people in English, and it's not even their language. It shows you the importance of stressing education, right? The importance of that culture and what they emphasize. It's a very strict culture, and they really value education. In this country, we don't value it as much, right? US schools are more segregated than they were 4 decades ago. They're segregated. You have the white people over here, the Latinos and the Black people over here, or most of the Black people are over here and some Latinos, right? But it's segregated. The Asian people are over there. And that's what it is. There's segregation, there is racism, but it's by income. If you can't afford to live in those nice neighborhoods, then you can't afford to go to those good schools. And guess who's in those good schools? Mostly white people. I'm not saying white people can't be poor. You have very bad schools over here in this valley, a lot of poor white people and Latinos and stuff. So over here, there's less segregation, I think. There is still segregation. There's more white people on the west side, by the way, than on the east side. But there is more diversity in schools, because my wife teaches in one of those schools in the east side, and there's plenty of white people and Black people and Latinos and not that many Asians, but there is a lot of segregation. And for the most part, lower income usually means more minorities, worse education. And I'm sorry, guys, but that's discrimination. That's racism, okay? Schools should be funded equally. If it's a public school, it shouldn't matter where it is. They should get equal funding. But it doesn't, because they passed some law many years ago that I consider racist, where funding for schools is determined by basically property tax. So if you live in a nice neighborhood where homes are more expensive, your school gets more money than if you live in a poor neighborhood. And I'm sorry, that's discrimination, that's racism, okay? That's what happens. And because, people cannot afford to live in certain places, apparently they can't go to a good school. There are other things like vouchers and charter schools, right, to try to escape some of these things, but these are controversial issues, right? Vouchers, right, where your kid can get a voucher to go to a different school or go to a charter school, right? But then that means the public school that they should be attending in their neighborhood loses money. So that makes the schools even worse when they lose money, right? Common Core, I won't talk too much about. That's the issue where kids should learn certain things at certain time, certain skills. Teachers hate it, by the way. It's basically standardizing education. And kids are different, and you can't standardize education. It needs to be different for different kids. Public education, public funding, right? The way the funding is distributed, right? Richer neighborhoods always have more funding, better schools, better library, better technology. The more skilled teachers, the better teachers end up teaching there. Why? Because teachers are like everybody else. They want to live and work in nice neighborhoods. So the ones that are better end up there in the nicer neighborhoods that tend to be richer and whiter. Okay? And that's the way it is. Those that end up in the poor neighborhoods, I'm not saying you can't have good teachers. There are plenty of good teachers, but you're going to have not necessarily the best teachers, and they're not all going to be good. There's a lot of bad teachers too. vouchers and charter school. I talked about homeschooling, right? Should you pull your kid out of school and educate them yourself? You have that right, okay? But then again, are you able to provide quality education? Most people cannot. Most students are better off in school. Let the teachers teach them. Parents are not educated enough to teach them, especially if you're poor. Public education, freedom of religion, right? Religion in schools, right? That kind of stuff, a lot of debate about that. The arts, right? Second language, computers, right? And technology. The poorest neighborhoods always have the worst computers, the worst technology, not enough technology, not enough money, right? Class size is always bigger in the poor neighborhoods, and class size really affects learning. Smaller class sizes are better for students. And they did pass a law, by the way, some years ago, where they, at least for the lower grade teachers, for the teachers in elementary school, they passed the rule that class sizes should be no more than 20. And they had that for a while. And you know what happened? After a while, the economy went down the drain. We had that 2008 recession, the economy went down the drain. They took that away. And then the economy got better, and they never went back to that. That's what happens, right? Whenever money gets tight, they take away things, they make things worse, and then they don't bring that back, that thing that worked, that thing that was getting better, right? Soft skills and education, you know, all that stuff. There's a lot of controversial. Education is very controversial. And you know why it's very controversial? Because there's a lot of money spent on education, and people are always fighting about money and how it should be used. And yes, there is discrimination, there is racism, there's a lot of problems. Okay, that is where I'll stop.